And we're going to get started on the webinar for secure connectivity across firewalls. My name is Gary Worsham. I'm with remote.it support. Thank you for joining us today. Here's an outline of our presentation. First, we're going to have an introduction, and I'm going to show you the easy way to solve connectivity problems. We'll go through several very common scenarios. I'll give you some debugging strategies. I'll show you where you can get additional information and help with any issues you may be having. And then we'll also have a Q&A session at the end. Who should watch this webinar? Well, system integrators, IT departments, or end users wanting to manage a very secure network. What should you know to get the most out of this webinar? You should know how your firewall is configured to allow specific types of network traffic. You should know how to configure remote services on your devices. You should know how to make proxy connections through the remote web portal or via API calls. And you should also know how to make peer-to-peer connections using either the remote desktop application or using the command line. Now, note that I said that's what you need to know to get the most out of it. If you don't know some of those things, it's okay. We'll explain them briefly, and hopefully you will see how those different ways of making connections are applicable to the topic. Now, the easy way to make remote work on your system is to enable all outgoing UDP on your target side firewall. That just means any request or any packet on any port to any destination outgoing. Now, by default, many consumer routers are configured this way, so if you're just setting up some devices at home, you may not need to change anything. And I am not going to suggest that you change anything on your firewall if your connections are currently working. You may choose to change them for other reasons, but it won't be because I suggested it. If your connections are not working, then we'll show you how to adjust your firewall so that they will work. And then leaving all outgoing UDP connections open may not be acceptable to users wanting to lock down their firewall as much as possible. And one of the reasons that we're having this webinar is this is a very common topic that I get support tickets on. So the first scenario we're going to discuss is making a proxy connection. And that is a type of connection that is made when you click on a service name in the remote web portal or use the Device Connect API endpoint. And there are two different types of proxy connections that you can get. You can use a reverse proxy, and this is used for connecting to web servers. And these generate a randomized URL, but the port is not remapped. So if you're connecting to, for example, a web server on a device and it is using TCP port 80, and you connect that using a reverse proxy setup, then the default port that will be used for this connection will be the same port 80. And when you make those type of connections, typically the connection, which looks similar to that one shown in the middle here, will open up directly in your browser. A port proxy, which is used for all other types of TCP service connections, returns a proxy URL, such as this one here, and then a randomized port in the range of 20,000 to 40,000. So that's the port over there. And if you've been making connections through our web portal, you will be familiar with those things because that's where these screenshots were taken from. Here's a little diagram that shows what happens when you make a proxy connection. You on your PC are over here by your client PC going through a client firewall, and then you connect to a remote chat server. And the device, which has the Connect daemons installed on it over here and are running, connect through your target firewall up to the remote chat server. In the target firewall, you have to allow outgoing UDP on ports 5959 to 5970. Once you do that, your status will show up with a green checkbox online in the web portal, and the device will appear as though it's ready for a connection. If this is all you do and you have all other ports blocked, you will not be able to make a connection. And on our next screen, we will show you why. Proxy servers, which are the data path, once you make the connection, the data will actually go through the proxy server, not the chat server. Our connection logic, as I showed previously, generates a random port for port proxy connections in the range of 20,000 to 40,000. And even if you're using TCP, our traffic is handled in transit using UDP. So the target firewall here needs to have outgoing UDP enabled from 20,000 to 40,000 to a short list of proxy servers in your region. And if you contact me with a support ticket, I will let you know what those proxy servers are. That list is not included in this presentation. And once you have whitelisted the URLs of the proxy servers, which is the easiest way to do this, you will now be able to make a connection. So just to review, the connection is the gray arrows and lines. The connection is initiated through the chat server. And then once the chat server establishes the connection, the proxy server opens up. You're given the URL and the port number to connect through, and then that goes through all of these firewalls. So those are the two things you will need to do to enable proxy connections using our system. The next scenario that you may encounter is a peer-to-peer connection. And this is made when you click on a service name in the remote.it desktop application, or when you use the connectee binary in peer-to-peer initiator mode. And both of these scenarios are documented up at our docs.remote.it website. So a peer-to-peer connection uses a local host address such as 127.0.0.1. And the port which will be used is specified by the user, and that's you, at the time the connection is configured in the desktop app. When you first click in the desktop app to create a connection, you're asked to enter a port, or I think it actually auto assigns them. Or if you're using the connectee daemon directly, this would be either on the command line or in the program that you wrote that uses that. And the first part of this is the same as in the proxy connection, because essentially we haven't yet made a connection. We're just looking at the target device communicating with our chat server through ports 5959 to 5970. It appears to be online. When you actually make the connection from the client side using either the desktop application or the peer-to-peer initiator mode of the connectee daemon, then rather than going through a proxy server, you have a direct data connection from the target device that goes directly to your client firewall and back here. So in order to allow that to happen in your target firewall, you can take one of two approaches. You can allow outgoing UDP to the port or ports used by peer-to-peer initiators. So what this means is that when you set up your connections for peer-to-peer connections over here, you will know which ports they use or which range of ports, and you'll have to set that over here in the target firewall. The other possibility that you have is that you can whitelist the public IP of the peer-to-peer initiator. This is similar if you're used to using Amazon Web Services. It's similar to an IP restriction in the security groups that will limit traffic to a specific source IP address. So once the peer-to-peer connection is established at the chat server, data flows directly through here, and that's how peer-to-peer connections work. This is somewhat of an oddball scenario, and we don't really think that too many people use this. But if you are on your client side behind a proxy server that limits traffic to only what you can get through port 80 and port 443, which are HTTP and HTTPS standard ports, then you'll only be able to make proxy connections to target services which were configured to use a reverse proxy. I don't actually think that this is a very common scenario, but if you are behind a proxy server like this, you will have pretty serious limitation in how you can use remote. It's simply because the other ports are not allowed through. And when you're setting up services on the device using our connectee installer, for example, on a Raspberry Pi, this option 2 that says web HTTP will configure the service as a reverse proxy. Here's some debugging strategies if you encounter any issues with trying to connect from devices, from your client location to devices. We suggest that you try both proxy and a peer-to-peer connection, because sometimes one will work or the other one doesn't, and it's very useful information to have if you send in a support ticket. And then also on a device that has the connectee package installed on the target LAN, you can run these two commands, and this will use the connectee daemon that's installed on the device in somewhat of a diagnostic mode to perform an analysis of the firewall and that writes information into a little text file, and then you send us that text file. It will help us quite a bit in terms of debugging any problems you may be having with that. If you have any other questions about using remote.it, we have a variety of resources you can access. Our doc site is the first one there. The help desk and knowledge base has a lot of debugging strategies there. And we also have a community forum there where you can see if anybody else has reported any issues or share what you're doing with other people and see if you can get a helpful remark from somebody. Of course, we also monitor that forum and will help people having any kind of an issue. And if you have any other questions or problems making connections, send an email to support@remote.it, and that will put a support ticket into our support ticket tracker, and I will probably answer it. One question that some people have asked is whether it's possible to use the UDP port range 5959 to 5970 for connections, because you already have to open that in order for your device to contact our chat servers. And the answer is, if you are using a peer-to-peer connection, yes, because when you're using a peer-to-peer connection, you are allowed to specify the port explicitly. If you want to limit the number of open UDP ports, you can just open 5959 through 5970, and then also make sure that you initiate your peer-to-peer connection within that range. You cannot do this for proxy connections because proxy connections use that full range of 20,000 to 40,000. Another question that we got ahead of time says, I'm using a mobile hotspot or cellular data connection for the target side internet connection. What should I do? And in our experience, it should not be necessary to do anything special in this scenario to allow an incoming connection either on peer-to-peer or proxy.
So the question is, in the peer-to-peer connection model, is there still the need to enable connections to the chat servers? If yes, from where? Initiator, target, or both? And the answer is yes. The chat servers always need to be allowed connection to. That is the actual command and control data coming between the endpoints, your device, and the initiator, to initiate connections, whether they are proxy connections or peer-to-peer connections. Okay, the question is, I am using public Wi-Fi to stream CCTV video. Should I set up a P2P direct connection? That's the question. The public Wi-Fi does not allow port forwarding for security reasons. I can to a Raspberry Pi VNC using service ports. Is P2P direct connection the way to go?
For streaming video, peer-to-peer connection is, unless your video is very low bandwidth, the peer-to-peer connection is in fact the preferred answer, because since the data is not being diverted to go through one of our proxy servers, you get the best bit rate possible by using a peer-to-peer connection. As far as public Wi-Fi, it wasn't clear to me if the public Wi-Fi was on the client or the target, but this is one of those situations where if, for example, the public Wi-Fi firewall was set to block all UDP, you would have a problem. So let's put it this way. If you set this up and test it and it works, it means that those UDP ports are open. If you set this up and it doesn't work, then you may have an issue because you may need to deal with the people who are managing that public Wi-Fi to open up those ports.
In my experience, 99 out of 100 times on most public Wi-Fi, this would work no problem, either initiator or target side.
You know, considering how many support tickets I've answered with this, it seemed like it was a pretty short presentation, but in fact, the situation is fairly simple. And I think what happens to a lot of people is that they have to give this information to somebody else that they're working with. Because, for example, you're installing a piece of gear in somebody else's network, such as a retail store, and you may not, if you're the vendor of some piece of equipment that's going in there, you may not have access to their networking infrastructure. So you need to be able to communicate what they need to do clearly in such a way. And it is my hope that this information will help you achieve that goal. I want to thank everybody for attending. I hope you found it useful and educational, and hope to see you at the next one. Thanks a lot.